You may have seen this meme. At the top we have the so-called anarcho-socialists, or just Marxists in general, who say, "Holy moly" to capitalists. Then we have the anarcho-capitalist snake saying, "Holy moly" to socialists. And finally we have the anarcho-idealists, the third positionists, who say, "Holy moly" to liberals. I think this meme is pretty accurate in the sense that it does show how these three groups see the world. As an ex-socialist, I can tell you that when I was a socialist, I thought that conservatives and Nazis were all the same. They're just racists and capitalists who want to exploit the poor. And now that I'm a free market guy, I can say that, while there is a difference, the National Socialists and the Marxists are two sides of the same coin. I've obviously beaten that horse to death in my previous documentaries, so I won't go over the arguments for that here. But it's the final stance that may surprise people. The fact that the National Socialists see the Marxists and the capitalists as both liberals. And this is the first clue that there's a problem with National Socialism's ideology. Why does a National Socialist come to the conclusion that Marxists and capitalists are liberals? And what do they mean by this? Well, National Socialists are very religious in their thinking. They're extreme altruists who hate two things in particular: individualism and materialism. They will say that the love of money is the root of all evil, and that a free market guy like myself is just giving in to his animal instincts and is being selfish. They'll say, "I'm not thinking about others and just want to eat the poor as I succumb to my hedonistic desires." They would argue that I've bought into the Jewish spirit, that all I want to do is exploit others for my own personal gain. And clearly, I'm just a fat cat consumerist who hoards material things as I pollute the planet and drive over the downtrodden in my Hummer. I did go in a Hummer once, and it was awesome. But they'll say that the Marxists are the same. When they look at the woke crowd, they'll say that it's all being done for selfish and material profit. The Marxists, after all, are self-proclaimed dialectical materialists. And Marx's entire creed was all about economics and redistributing material wealth to the in-group. And the reason why, the National Socialists will say, is because they're selfish materialists. When a National Socialist sees a person identifying as trans, let's say, they'll see it as a selfish act, a manifestation of extreme individualism. When they see people dyeing their hair in different colours, cross-dressing, wearing ridiculous outfits, if any at all, drag queen story hour, and screeching like children, they'll see this as a breakdown of society and decency. They will call these people degenerates and long for the comeback of a religious morality system that says thou shalt suppress yourself. Selfishness is evil, says altruism. Pride is a sin. You can't be proud of your gender or your children. They're not your children, they're God's children. And therefore, individualism and materialism, they say, are both products of one evil ideology, which is liberalism. That's right, the National Socialists see both the Marxists and the capitalists as one and the same, two horns of the same devil, liberalism, which they also think is Jewish. That's why they hate the Jews. And they say what we need to do is get away from selfish materialism and look to a higher power. The reason why they say this is because they're idealists. Idealism is the belief that reality is created by the mind, either your own or God's mind. The god of the National Socialists is Odin or Wotan, but even if you disagree with me on that and think that they're Christians, the fact is that they believe in a supernatural being that created everything. And that means that reality is little more than a mirage. It's all in the mind of God. So material things are not real. They're fake. They're God's imagination. Materialism is a fake reality, and what we need to do, they think, is realize this, then come together as a collective, hence their racism, and then we'll be able to transcend this fake material reality and reunite with God. But, they'll say, there are those among us who wish to keep us living in this fake material world, and of course, these are the Jews, or the bourgeoisie. They say that the Judeo-bourgeoisie are selfish materialists who reject God and want to keep us on this plane of existence, which is a prison for the soul of man. As soon as the spirit of egotism begins to prevail among a people, then the bonds of the social order break, and man, by seeking his own personal happiness, veritably tumbles out of heaven and falls into hell. Posterity will not remember those who pursued their own individual interests, but it will praise those heroes who renounced their own happiness. The Jew offers the most striking contrast to the Aryan. There is probably no other people in the world who have so developed the instinct of self-preservation as the so-called chosen people. Hitler says this sort of stuff a lot, and we could be here all day if I was to quote it all. So for the sake of brevity, I won't do that, but in a nutshell, the National Socialists are against selfish individualism and hedonistic materialism. They are idealists who want to unite the race in their collectivist struggle for the spirit of mankind. That is why this meme exists. The other two positions, they say, are liberals who have given into a corrupt ideology. The cure for this disease, they think, is a true spiritual altruism where we refrain from these earthly pleasures and turn to a cosmic order. And this kind of makes sense until you start to think it through. To aim for God, we must reject our selfish individualism and hedonistic materialism. But the concept of race is material. It's biological. Our bodies are not spiritual things. They're based in this reality. Even if they believe that this reality is fake, the fact is that our bodies, and therefore our race, are based in reality, which they say is materialist. Well, they reject materialism. They reject the very thing that supposedly proves that different races exist. They say we should embrace a spiritualism and idealism and not give in to worldly things, while at the same time championing worldly things like race and evolution. This is a huge contradiction that's slap bang in the middle of their ideology. But it gets worse. They reject individualism as well. They say that we're all part of our collective race. Okay, but what about survival of the fittest? Under the concept of survival of the fittest individual competes with everyone else, passing on their selfish genes to the next generation. If a fit German wants to ensure his superiority lives on, he has to outcompete the other weaker Germans to secure a mate. So the fit German has to compete against the race and against the racial community in order to breed. Rather than rejecting selfish individualism and cooperating together towards the collective, the selfish individual competes against the race on a biological level, proving that there is no racial collective. Our biology is clear. We're not working together to benefit each other altruistically. We're in competition against each other as selfish individuals. The survival of the fittest or social Darwinist concept actually destroys the idea that there's some sort of collective race that we're all supposedly working towards, which is the central idea of National Socialism. It actually drives a stake right into the heart of National Socialist ideology, and Hitler himself wasn't able to pull it out. As a racial socialist, he wanted to unite the German race into a national collective, a people state. But he had this survival of the fittest concept to consider, and since individualism and collectivism are polar opposite ideas, they don't go together properly. And so what he does is he takes his racial socialism and slaps the concept of individualism on the side and just kind of hopes that nobody would notice. Well, I've noticed, and the result is a contradictory ideology with a fundamental flaw at the heart of it. So let's just recap. Survival of the fittest says that we're all individuals, selfishly competing against each other, and therefore there cannot be a collective race that we're all working towards. But if they insist that there is a race that we're all working towards, then this race is based on biology, which places it in material reality. Well, they then try to reject material reality whilst simultaneously championing materialism on the biological level, a massive contradiction that doesn't make sense. If you insist that races exist, then that is materialism. So you can't then be against it. And I said this on Twitter recently. National Socialists are actually anti-white in a roundabout way, since they reject materialism, biology and skin colour in favour of idealism, spiritual supernaturalism. It's contradictory nonsense. This argument will work for the casual racists and members of the National Socialist movement, but it won't work for the leadership or the intellectuals. Why? Because those who have actually done their reading know that National Socialism isn't based in science. They know that there's no such thing as race, it's just rhetoric. Hitler himself didn't see race as biological. According to Hitler's view, there were not only racial differences between the nations, but also within the community of Germans. The German nation was still not a uniform race, but was composed of different racial elements. According to Hitler's understanding, there were racial elements, for example, which were more musically, others which were more technically scientifically, again others which were more politically gifted or capable, and so forth. While this is rather strange, basically no longer a biological definition of race, we must accept it as it is if we want to understand the inner logic of Hitler's reasoning at all. Racial war need not break out if people are selected not according to their appearance, but according to their achievements. Looks and ability are often quite far apart. You can make the selection according to the appearance, and you can make it, as the party has done, according to the test of life. So the race is not important. It's all about your ability. Whoopsie. Goebbels himself, whose appearance would also hardly have fulfilled the criteria of the SS, vehemently turned against the nonsense of race materialism, which does not look to position and persuasion, but to peroxide blonde. Zitelmann gives more evidence for this in his book, highly recommended, and it's dotted throughout the literature as well, but logically it makes sense for Hitler and Goebbels to conclude this. First off, the National Socialist leadership were not blonde-haired, blue-eyed Aryans. Hitler himself was an Austrian German. But secondly, they're idealists. What mattered was the inner spirit, the inner consciousness, not the material outer body. Now, the SS did judge people according to their religion or their appearance, but this was because it was difficult to tell who was racially or spiritually Jewish or not. The Einsatz commandos could not screen the Soviet prisoners of war very carefully. The only group that could easily be identified at this point were male Jews. German guards examined penises for circumcision. Very occasionally, Jews survived by claiming to be circumcised Muslims. More often, circumcised Muslims were shot as Jews. At least 50,000 Soviet Jews were shot after selection, and about 50,000 non-Jews as well. And this didn't just apply to the German prisoner of war camps. They had to identify people based on their religion and their circumcisions, or maybe even what they were wearing, rather than their race or spirit, and the reason why is because they couldn't tell the difference by general appearance alone. But it was also because they were idealists. The blood is the spirit, and the spirit is the blood. National Socialism only pretends to be biological or scientific, when in fact it is nothing more than a religion. It's idealist, not materialist. So this is a massive contradiction. They claim to be against materialism and in favour of racism, but the concept of race itself requires materialism to function. So, having embraced Hegelian dialectics, they simply ignore this contradiction because, in reality, they're against science, against race, and are actually all about spiritual enlightenment. They don't care about your biology, they only care about your spirit. If you have the Aryan spirit, they think you're good, and if you have the Jewish spirit, they think you're bad. The biology is secondary to this idea. But even though we've exposed the lie that they are scientific racists when they're just making it up as they go along, they might argue that there is still a race. It may not be materialistic, but they might argue it is spiritual. The racist spirit must exist somewhere out there in the ether, and members of the race are all connected to it via our spiritual consciousness. Obviously, I could just point out that there is no collective consciousness and that they're making it up to suit their agenda and that they have no evidence for any of these claims. It's not science, it's fantasy. But we all know that evidence-based arguments don't work against religious fanatics. So what I need to do is crush this idea on a philosophical level. Well, let's do that now. The National Socialists and racists would argue that we are born into a certain race and that this race has a certain spirit. This spirit pre-programs us to think and act in a certain way. In other words, just like religious people believe, racists say we are all predetermined to think and act the exact same way based on a collective consciousness, God. This means that our lives are not in our control. Any decision we make in life, they say, has already been decided in advance by the Spirit. The reason they say this, of course, is because God, or Odin, is all-powerful. He has created everything in the past and the future, and has determined everything we will do in advance because if we were to act independently, then that means he's not all-powerful. So everything must be predetermined by God, or in this case, the racial consciousness of Odin. But if we are predetermined to act in a certain way, then there cannot be any morality. If a man kills another, we cannot pass judgment on the man, since he was predetermined to do that by some higher power. Punishment would be pointless, since he didn't commit the crime, God did. In effect, determinism says you have no free will, no volition, no ability to choose, which means that you have no mind. But as I pointed out in a previous video, we are human, and what separates humans from the animals is our ability to think. Our minds are what make us human. We do not operate on our animal instincts. If we hold a certain view in our minds, we can change that view. We operate independently. We are not just our skin colour. Our thoughts are not determined before we're born. We can live and learn and experience and grow. We can integrate the knowledge we discover of the world around us and change our views for the better. What the National Socialists do is deny our humanity, deny our ability to think. They treat us like cattle or breeds of dogs. They believe that your nature is determined by some divine force before you're even born. And while you might be born into a certain family that holds certain beliefs, the fact is that you have a brain and you can use that brain to grow and learn and change those beliefs. And so yes, you could fall into a certain belief system, or a certain culture, or religion, or ideology. But that doesn't mean you have to stay there. That's why we see Christians turning away from Christianity, and Muslims turning away from Islam. We call them deconstructionists, and they're all over YouTube. Of course, you then have people joining these religions because, again, they started in one place and changed their minds. They're individuals with individual brains and individual thoughts. Therefore, saying that someone is predetermined to act in a certain way because they came from a certain background, nation, race, gender, or whatever isn't correct, because it denies the one thing that makes us human: our minds. And so, if you are human, and if you use your brain, then you are not a breed of dog, you are not a type of cattle, and you are not your skin colour. You are not an animal, you are not a group, you are a human, and therefore an individual. And because you're an individual with your own mind and your own thoughts, you are therefore independent. There is no invisible Ethernet cable connecting you to some invisible collective brain. There are no classes, no races, no gender spirits or collective consciousnesses. There is only the consciousness of the individual. And if you deny this and argue that there is an invisible collective consciousness that determines how you think, then what you're doing is denying your own intelligence. You're calling yourself stupid. In fact, when I made this argument in the previous video, those who disagreed argued that they were, in fact, animals, and even argued that they didn't use their brains and were dumb. One person said, humans are animals though. To think we're not is misguided. Humans are different to non-human animals, however. I mean, straight away there's a contradiction. We're animals, but we're different to animals, even though we're not. Right, okay, talk about mental gymnastics. So I said, you might be an animal and you might wallow in filth, but I'm not and I don't. I have a mind and I use it. And what was his comeback? Lol, sensitive boy. Yeah, because he has no argument. He's just said he's an animal who doesn't think. That's his entire argument. Well done for being a dog. This other person said, I disagree with your people have brains and so we aren't animals and race doesn't matter point. Humans are animals. Oh really? Which animal are you? A cow? We're evolved creatures and we have brains. Well, why don't you start using them then? If we have brains, if we have intelligence, we are not an animal, because they allow us to organise, plan and make better decisions for the purpose of survival. Yes, we think long term, animals don't. We're not just running around on four legs and eating grass. Our intelligence is massively superior to that of an animal, which is why we're not the same. The reason for a lot of things people often think are intrinsic to reality is actually that it's simply evolutionary useful. Pain, pleasure, sadness, joy, hatred and love are all things that evolved so that living creatures can survive better. None of those things are based on race, and even though it may be pleasurable to do something, a human can decide to do something else. You might choose to go through pain to get the benefits of losing weight and developing a stronger muscle mass. We can decide to do that because we're not reliant on our instincts. We are able to think, weigh up the options and plan ahead. And that's why I replied, you may operate on your instincts and wallow in filth, but I don't. I'm not an animal, I'm a conscious being who uses my brain. And somebody else said, we're both, to be honest. We have logical brains, but we are also inescapably animals in a physical animal body. Our bodies are biological, but our minds, meaning the conscious part of our bodies, are different. I can think and change my mind on things, therefore my mind is not determined by my biology. I am my mind, and while my mind cannot live without my body, my mind is who I am. Do not judge me by my race, judge me by my mind, my character, and what I do or don't do. The race part is irrelevant. There were a few counter-arguments that tried to skirt around this issue, but they were all equally flawed. One lot argued that races clearly have different nose sizes, male organ sizes, medical conditions, IQ and testosterone. But I responded by saying that individuals of the same race have different nose sizes, male organ sizes, medical conditions, IQ and testosterone. So why draw the line at race when it should be drawn at the individual level? They then said I was playing dumb and started calling me names, because of course they did, but it isn't playing dumb at all. It's not that we're members of a race or a gender or a class. We are independent individuals with our own minds. So don't lump me in with the Platos in Parliament, or the racist state police, or the monarchists, or the people who work for Goebbels' Ministry of Enlightenment, the BBC. Yes, we might live on the same island, but I have absolutely nothing in common with these people, because I actually have a conscience. I take responsibility for my own life, and I don't leech off of others. I will associate with those people I think are worthy, and ignore those who find virtue in lying in the gutter. So just because I come from England doesn't mean I'm the same as everyone from England. Clearly not. So most of the counter-arguments boil down to either admitting that they, the racists, didn't think, or that they insisted they were animals. Which is interesting. We have a bunch of third positionists declaring with absolute certainty that they are unthinking animals, and far from me to disagree with you on that point. So if any of you are wondering why National Socialists are some of the most violent, murderous and emotional people on the planet, that tend to have few friends and get ostracized by the rest of society, it's actually because of their altruistic ideology. They tend to act like monks in their daily life and deny themselves pleasure, but this policy of self-denial eventually backfires. Unable to live a life as a saint for too long, they give in to temptation and succumb to their hedonistic urges. For example, here's what a fascist that I've mentioned before in some of my videos, Zoran Zoltanus, recently said. I'm going to be straight up with everyone who follows me. Politically, yes, he is a fascist. However, I've reached a point of zero interest in doing political stuff unless it's trolling/theatre to annoy people or doing funny stuff with a semi-serious edge. I'm more interested in that at this point, which means my videos are going to change completely, and articles by me will eventually stop. I'll still keep Fascio up, plus I have other writers besides myself there. I'm 28, and I've never really been independent in my life until now, because I lived like a NEET who was controlled by his family. I'm so socially inept in living skills that I'm like a teenager to most people who know me in person, to the point that it's embarrassing. I still don't have a driver's license, just to emphasize this point. Moreover, many people probably are not aware, but I do have ADHD, Asperger's syndrome, frequent manic episodes, and psychomotor depression. I'm not mentally stable or well, meaning I want to fix my life a bit if I can. I want a functioning life while experiencing fun as an adult, living life for once. I'm not going to be able to do this while being hyper-focused on a dead-end political scene with no national movement, program or party for it. He then proceeds to post himself going to parties, taking hardcore powders, and posting memes where he's talking about committing Sudoku. He also deleted a bunch of his YouTube videos, which is a shame because I hadn't seen them all yet. Apparently the trigger was him losing his girlfriend, but regardless of the exact reason, this is not atypical behaviour from someone in the third positionist camp. I've seen this so many times before it's unreal, and I'm not denying that he has those medical conditions, I'm sure he has, but I suspect some of them are actually symptoms of the true disease, which is his altruistic ideology. This is an ideology that says deny yourself, sacrifice yourself, give yourself up for others and receive no reward in exchange. Don't do anything that benefits yourself and then wonder why you're poor at age 28 with no prospects or social skills. Then, because you can't live life as a monk forever, have a mental breakdown and give in to your hedonistic pleasures in a toxic-fueled animalistic binge. Obviously, I'm not in agreement with Zoltan's ideology, but I don't want to see someone destroy themselves in this manner, especially because his ideology is self-refuting. So to Zoltan and anyone else in the third positionist camp who's looking for a way out of this, your first step is to recognise the problem. For that reason, I recommend you read this book. And everyone else should read this book too, because it's fantastic. This is Leonard Peikoff's The Cause of Hitler's Germany. Those of you who have read it, let others know in the comments below how good this book actually is. You see, Zoltan and the other fascists and National Socialists are all claiming to be altruists. They say we must come together as a collective in order to build a great society and protect our nation and our race. But despite their claim, National Socialists are not true altruists. We've all got to come together and help each other and those in need, but then they'll turn around and say that the other races are bad and that we must have segregation, which is the opposite of altruism. If the other races are inferior, a true altruist would sacrifice himself for them and help those in need. Yet the racist will be selfish and demand segregation purely because he doesn't actually want to help these people. So they're not actually altruists, they're just pretending that they're altruists. They don't give a hoot about anyone else but themselves. They don't care about you at all. They're just saying that they do care about you to win support, to get social brownie points. They're just people-pleasing narcissists. And altruism itself is not a good thing. If I felt sorry for Zoltan and gave him money to help him out like a good little altruist, what's he going to do? Improve his life? No. He's going to go all Guy Fawkes on us and blow it all on powder. You can only help those who want to help themselves. And if they want to help themselves, they don't need your help. Charity just rewards bad behaviour and incentivizes people to stay in the gutter. Altruism rewards degeneracy. And that's another contradiction that the National Socialists have. They're a bunch of altruists who want to end degeneracy and save the race by bringing us all together to help those members of the race who are in need. But all that does is reward and incentivize people to be victims. It promotes a victim mentality, which is why Hitler himself always played the victim. Germany started several wars in Europe, and when it won those wars it took what it wanted. But when it lost those wars it blamed everyone else and accused them of bullying it, even though they're the ones who were the aggressors. And altruism's rewarding of victimhood is the reason why society is divided into two sets of people: the looters and the producers. Those who believe themselves to be victims think that they're entitled to loot from the more productive members of society. From benefit scroungers to priests, taxmen, politicians, thieves and beggars, all these people and more have used altruism to justify the most inhuman and immoral act of all: slavery. Slave away for decades of your life so that we, the looters, get to take half of it off you and then break all our promises about state pensions and health services when you're at the end of your life. And the worst part about this is that people continue to believe their lies. I've paid in all of my life. You've got to contribute to Goddess society. These righteous people think that they're morally justified to enslave others, to loot others, and to tell others how to live their lives. And then they'll turn around and claim it's for your benefit. No, it's not. Altruism is nothing other than a scam, an immoral scam invented by those who loot to exploit those who produce. And the National Socialist German Workers' Party felt justified in enslaving the producers so that it could loot as much wealth and resources off them as possible. And the same thing is happening today with our debt-based Keynesian economic inflation and tax model. So what they'll do is throw out the Kantian argument. You must contribute to society because it is your duty. You must stand up and defend your nation and race. In other words, it is your obligation to slave away for other people. You must obey the commands of others. The concept of duty is altruism made manifest. And of course, being a religious cult, duty in the National Socialist sense means obedience to the commands of Odin, or whatever god each individual race chooses to believe in this week. But what duty does is destroy our humanity. Instead of doing the thing that interests me, instead of thinking things through and making rational decisions, I have a duty to override my own brain and do X, Y, Z for dear leader. Under duty, I don't have a choice. I must comply with whatever whims the leader decides. The problem, of course, is that this forces people to go against their own needs, go against their own thinking, and forces them into the slavery of others. And I actually had an argument with someone on Twitter who was saying that you have a duty to your children. Now, I don't have children, but most mothers who have children want to look after their children. They take responsibility for their own children. And so, no duty is required. But let's just say there's a mother who develops postnatal depression and doesn't want to look after her kid. Altruists would demand that she does her motherly duty, even though she doesn't want to. And so, the result will be neglect and possibly even abuse of the child. If, however, there was no duty, someone else could step in for selfish reasons and take responsibility for the child instead. If, for some reason, my sister couldn't look after my nephew, I would step in to take care of it. He's my nephew. I'm incentivized to look after him. So no duty is required. No higher power is needed. My point here is that duty is actually immoral. When someone tells me that I have a duty to fight for my race or nation, I'll tell them that no, I don't. I'll voluntarily fight for my own freedom, for my own interests, but not for tyranny. And I'm not fighting for a bunch of looters. I'm not fighting for a den of thieves. If this was a good society that valued individual freedom and free markets, then yeah, sure, I'd fight for that because it would be in my interest to fight for that. But since we live in an altruistic cesspool where everyone thinks they're morally right to reach into my pocket and take my money, I'm not interested. And it doesn't make sense. My patrons are paying me to make these videos and someone else thinks that they're entitled to take that money that they've given to me. It doesn't make any sense. So the argument against the National Socialist duty argument is simply this. It is not in my moral interest to support your immoral society. And there are other flaws in the National Socialist ideology that I'd like to point out. Going off the meme at the beginning, the National Socialists think that the Marxists are liberals. And by that, they mean materialists and individualists. But they're not individualists, they're collectivists. When a Marxist declares himself to be a member of the trans community, they're not saying that they're an individual trans person. They're declaring themselves to be members of a community, a collective. They're saying they're a member of the LGBTQ community. The community part is the collectivism. They're not for individualism. Otherwise, they wouldn't exclude white cisgendered men, as they call them. Nor would they exclude everyone else who disagrees with their BS. There are gay people like Jack David and trans people like Blair White who do not see themselves as part of the LGBTQ community because they're strong independent individuals who are appalled by the collectivism and Marxist degeneracy. So no, the Marxists aren't individualists. And they're not materialists either, since the end result of materialism is idealism, if you follow it to its most logical conclusion. I've been over that argument in previous videos, so I won't go over that again, but I will point out that the philosophical founder of fascism, Giovanni Gentile, made the case that Karl Marx was a confused idealist, and his essay stating this was cited by Lenin. So the point here is that the National Socialists have a flawed view of what Marxism is. They also have a flawed view of what free market people like myself stand for. I'm not liberal, I'm not materialist, I'm not idealist, I'm not hedonistic, nor am I anything else like that. They have no idea what I stand for because they refuse to listen or read the literature. They'd rather rely on their lazy animalistic instincts to dismiss anything that disagrees with them as being Jewish rather than actually put in the work and use their brains. Famously, they burn books that they disagree with because, as Vogelin would say, it's the self-censorship of the adherents of the faith. They turn off their thinking brains and merely act in blind faith. And the final argument I'll give today is that these National Socialists present themselves as revolutionaries. They demand change, or Aufheben, or struggle, Mein Kampf, or action, as Mosley would put it. Well, if you're a revolutionary who wants change, why are you against revolutionary change on the spiritual or biological level? Why would a revolutionary limit the radical process of evolution? Why would a revolutionary be so scared of ideas? The fact is that, just like the Marxists, you're not revolutionaries. You're reactionaries. You say you want change, but in reality you want to hinder progress and keep things as they are. Or worse, you want us to go back to the good old days of times past, when we were all serfs on the farm. You say you want struggle, but then hinder the competition of the free market, which is evolutionary. A free market is a naturally evolving economy, unhindered by central planners. They don't like evolution. They just pretend that they do because the whole ideology is contradictory nonsense. So, to summarise and conclude, the central contradiction of National Socialism lies in its attempt to fuse incompatible ideas together. While claiming to reject materialism and embrace a spiritual idealism, National Socialists ground their ideology in material realities like race and biology. The concept of survival of the fittest undermines the idea of a racial collective because evolutionary competition is inherently individualistic. They claim that their biology is based on science, but their definition of race relies on a mystic spirit or blood, betraying a religious idealism that champions spiritual enlightenment over reality. They say we're predetermined to think and act in specific ways, denying personal volition and human minds in favour of an invisible collective consciousness, akin to a mystical network. This denies the uniquely human ability to think, learn and change, reducing humans to the level of animals, denying individuality, agency and independence. While claiming to promote collective welfare, National Socialists contradict their own altruistic claims by promoting segregation and victimhood, rewarding dependency rather than productivity. The ideology fosters a victim mentality where looters exploit the producers under the guise of duty, an immoral concept that denies individual freedom and rational choice. In essence, National Socialism's altruistic rhetoric is a facade that justifies their desire for control as they reduce people to obedient slaves of the collective. And National Socialists misunderstand both Marxism and free markets, failing to acknowledge that Marxists are collectivists. Despite claiming revolutionary ideals, National Socialists oppose genuine intellectual and societal progress, which just betrays their reactionary tendencies. Their reliance on censorship and rejection of the intellect just highlights the fact that their ideology is flawed. It cannot stand against criticism. And my arguments today show why National Socialism is a fundamentally flawed and contradictory ideology. But for further understanding, be sure to subscribe if you haven't done so already, and if you haven't read Peikoff's The Cause of Hitler's Germany, I'd highly recommend that you do so. Thanks for watching, bye for now.